Hey, this is John. Thanks for joining me for this video today. In this video, I'm going to continue building Bandai's TIE Striker, but as I mentioned in the previous video in this series, the emphasis is going to be not only on building this specific kit, but talking about building any TIE Fighter in Bandai's TIE Fighter family. Because while they all look different in terms of assembly and engineering and coloring, they're almost all virtually identical. I think some of the New Order TIE Fighters have some different coloring, which would need to be addressed separately. But for the most part, they're all gray and black. They all have a certain style of weathering. They all have a certain layout. So in building this, it will be easy to talk about building the others and what to look out for and what can be useful and helpful and beneficial in enjoying these kits, because they are quite fun and I recommend them to anybody. Now, in the first episode of this series, I focused solely on building the cockpit module and the pilot and getting the decals in the interior, because this little pod here is the same for all TIE Fighters. There may be some external differences in how it connects with the pieces around it, but the actual interior of it and the handling of it is going to be the same whether you're building a regular TIE Fighter, Darth Vader's TIE Fighter, this TIE Striker, a TIE Interceptor, whatever it is. It's got this little dodecahedric thingamabob shape in there, and that's going to be the same. Before I get any further in this video, I need to take a moment to do something very important. I need to give a shout out to my buddy James. Hey James, how are you doing today? I hope you're enjoying this. I hope you and your dad are having a good time watching this. And I'm just so thankful that you like these videos, and I hope you continue enjoying them, and that you and your dad get some time to build some models together. So keep studying hard, keep doing what mom and dad tell you, and you're going to do great things, okay? Talk to you later, James. Now, when you proceed on from that, in this build, it's of course going to be a little different in that you have this large, longer fuselage shape that the TIE Striker features that's not part of the TIE Fighter or the Advanced TIE Fighter, also known as Darth Vader's TIE Fighter, or the TIE Interceptor. The TIE Fighter and the TIE Interceptor have the more traditional just round shape, although their solar panels are a little different. And then of course Darth Vader's has a different look also, in that it has the same round shape at the core and then two beefier pylons coming off from that, and then kind of a tail going back from that. But in all cases, the assembly is about the same. You take this pod that composes the interior, and then you put it in some kind of outer shell. So that outer shell may be round, it may be long, it may be short. In fact, on this TIE Interceptor, or this TIE Striker rather, the front half of the fuselage, which is here, and the back half, if you take those two like that, look at what you've got. You've essentially got a TIE Fighter, the traditional TIE Fighter. Now the two don't fit together because they're not designed to do so on this kit. But even this TIE Striker is really just like taking the TIE Fighter and simply stretching it out into a longer fuselage. So all of this can be assembled in the same way. Now the way I've done this is, once I get the cockpit painted, I go ahead and I fully assemble this fuselage part. The steps in this particular kit take you through to the point of getting it like that before you move on to the wings. Now, there are a few little greeblies that go on there. There's some guns that go on them, so those will need to be addressed. On the TIE Fighter, these little parts that look kind of like bow ties, they're a different color than the rest of it, and we're going to talk about color in just a minute. They're a different color than the rest of it, as are these parts back here. On the TIE Fighter and on Darth Vader's TIE Fighter, which I built, those are a different shade of gray. On this kit, the little bow ties are black, so I'm keeping them separate so that I can paint them separate to get real good, crisp, sharp edges. But the way the kit is laid out, it makes it really easy to put those on later, so they don't have to be done initially as shown in the instructions. Another area to consider when you're building any of Bandai's TIE Fighters are the parts that represent the front canopy and the top hatch. On this kit, they're here and here. Now, the shape of the top hatch is a little different for the other TIE Fighters, but there's a top hatch and there's this front part. Bandai provides two different styles of part. One is this part that's just see-through. There's no clear part to it. And then they also provide a clear part that you can mask off and paint. On the regular TIE Fighter and Darth Vader's TIE Fighter, and I'm pretty sure if you're building the TIE Interceptor, check it. This is a different color of gray than the rest of the kit. I can't remember if it's lighter or darker, but it's a different color of gray. The hatch is the same as the rest of the model. What this part for, the reason they have these parts without any clear in them is, one, it makes it easier to see the interior, but two, as I understand it, this is what I've been told. I haven't researched this, but I've been told this by a couple of people that I trust what they say, is that on the studio versions of the fighters for filming, they did not use clear parts in them so that it wouldn't reflect light. So, assuming that to be the case, if you want it to be more in the style of the studio fighter, then you would want to use these. I prefer the clear parts, so I'm going to use these. Now, because this part is the same color as the rest of the kit, I'll mask this off, mount it on the kit, and paint it in place. This part, because it's a different color, so that I can get a good sharp line, what I'll do is I'll mask this off and paint it off the kit and only add it later. Now, whichever set of parts you're using, the other set can be a handy little mask, meaning while this will be masked off and I'll stick it on the top, I can actually use this part when I'm painting, and I can just put some tape on the inside of this or even on the outside of it and stick it on there, and it makes a real convenient mask, and then I can just pop that off and put this part on. If you're planning on using these parts, you can use these as masks without any alteration. You just stick them on, paint over them because you're not going to use them, and then later on pop them off and you have these on. So it's a really handy way, regardless of the kit you're building, of masking off the internal parts. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and get some of this snapped up. I'm going to take this cockpit part, and it's got some tabs in here that slide right in there. And if you're building one of the other TIE Fighters, the cockpit module will slide into these parts just as well, and make it easy to get in there. And then I'm going to go in, and what's next? I want to make sure I'm not missing any parts. I'm going to go ahead and snap this on. Now, they say this is easy enough a child can do it, but sometimes I'm not grown up enough to do it right. All right, so I've got that on there. And then I want to take this, making sure it's faced up correctly. Now, I went ahead and glued on the little lasers right here. They're the same color. The tips will be painted a little different, but I glued those on. So I'll go ahead and add that part on. And then on the back, there's a part here. And notice, this is cool. This is how good Bandai is at their reproduction. On the original TIE Fighter, that was actually a bogie, not a bogie, but a suspension part from a Sherman tank model. And if you know your Sherman tanks, you can see that right there. It's real cool on these Bandai Star Wars kits, what you can see in terms of parts and things from other models. If you look on the Y-wing, there is along back fuselage on either side, you can see shovels that were glued on there, and those are kind of cool to see. So Bandai's done a real good job in reproducing those. Now on this TIE Striker, there are 4 little panels that go on here that will be the same color as the rest of the model. Any of these external panels you put on, whether it's the bow tie shaped things that I showed earlier that are going to go here and here and here and here, or these panels on the top, any of these little external panels, one of the things to keep in mind is it's real important to clean up all of the nub marks, all of the sprue attachment points, so that you get a really good fit. If you clean those up well, it will fit correctly. And I've already put on several of them here, and I'm going to put this one on. Pay attention in the instructions. They give you these little rabbit ears that say, okay, you need to pay attention to the alignment of it. Look at the instructions. They show you how it's supposed to be aligned. What it's showing is that these little greeblies like this need to face on the back part, they need to face towards the back, and on the front they need to face towards the front. And so you just slide it right in there, and it's a good fit. General rule of thumb when building anything Bandai is if it doesn't fit, the problem is probably you, not Bandai. You need to check the cleanup or anything like that. After I get everything assembled, and I've still got a few steps to go on the fuselage, but after I get everything assembled, I like to put some glue in the joins, because like right here, you see there's a little bit of a crack there. But if I glue this and just push those parts in together and hold that for a few seconds with the glue, it completely seals up that little hairline crack there. Same along here. Now you have to be careful because you want to preserve that seam line. So you have to be careful not to squeeze so hard that it extrudes up a little bit of plastic. You don't want a bead of plastic coming up there that you have to cut off. You want to put in some glue and give it just a little bit of pressure to make sure that it's sealed well, but that you're not squeezing up any glue. A great way to do that is to put the glue on, let it run through with capillary action. I almost said it the British way, the capillary action, and give it 10-15 seconds to dry, and then push it together, and that'll help close up the seam. And you'll get a real good fit with all of these parts. And when they're fitted together correctly, then it's also ready for the next steps. All right, on this TIE Striker, there's a part that goes on the bottom. I've gone ahead and glued the guns in. They're small enough that I don't think that I'll be, breaking them off with it. On the other kits, there's basically just a round cover that goes over the bottom. So you'll just pop that on. And that's what I'm going to do here with this. And the beauty of it is Bandai, it makes it almost entirely foolproof. You can't get this thing on any other way. There's only one way to get this on. Just like with Sammy Hagar, there's only one way to rock. Well, with Bandai, there's only one way to stick them on. And now you've got, it looks really good there. And I'll just run a little glue along that when I'm satisfied that I have all the parts on. I'm also going to go ahead and stick on this clear part. I'm going to mask this with masking fluid. Normally when I'm masking, I mask off the model, then stick it on the model. But because I'm going to be using masking fluid, it will actually make this easier because I can hold the model with this hand and paint it on with this hand. Now, for this front piece, I'm going to use this as a temporary mask. So I'll put some tape behind that and just put that over that just as a way of helping cover that up. Now, one thing I will need to do is I will need to go in and paint this little part. It's part of this forward part here. And every single TIE Fighter I built, I forget to paint that until later on in the process. But it's easy to do so. You just put a touch of gray paint on there, give it a quick dry brush, and you're good to go. All right, so aside from putting some masking in here, and of course I've got those little bow tie parts set off to the side so I can paint them a different color. We've got the fuselage done, and as Bandai shows here, check. All right, the next thing to talk about are the solar panels. Now on this TIE Striker, it has these very distinctive bat-like wings that stick out to the front and they can fold up and down. It's a very different look than most of the others. But of the TIE Fighters, All of them, with one exception, present the parts as a piece of framework, the solar panels that go into it, and then another piece of framework that fills that in. On this TIE Striker, you have this section of frame here, and then there's a solar panel that fits inside of it. And then this piece that goes over the top, because it fits inside of that lower gray piece, it means you're not going to have any seam lines to clean up along the edge here. And the fit is going to be tight enough. I'm not going to push it in because it's so tight that I won't be able to get it apart. But the fit will be tight enough here that you won't have to worry about doing anything more than adding just a few beads of glue to make sure that it holds together. Now, that makes it real easy to paint and weather. Because what I do, and this is just a suggestion, you can do it how you want, I paint these panels fully disassembled like this. I weather them disassembled like this. I do everything that needs to be done. And then I also do these interior panels separately, and only towards the very end of the build do I then bring them together and do any final weathering that might need to appear on the whole thing. Now, painting and weathering these is easy enough. The way I do these is I generally paint them a dark gray, and then I give them a dry brush and a wash. You don't see pictures in Canon of, a lot of weathering. You don't see any rust or streaks or stains. I mean, you can put those on there. You can do it however you want. But these are fairly simple in their presentation. So on the TIE Fighter, the TIE Interceptor, and the TIE Striker, these are all very easy to handle. Now, on Darth Vader's TIE Fighter, Bandai's wizardry, they cast them as one part in two colors. So when you get them, when you open up the box, he's got those wings that are shaped kind of like that. When you get it, each wing is completely assembled. The interior section is black, the exterior section is gray. So in one sense, it's good because they're all together and you don't have to worry about assembly. But then the first time I worked on it, I thought, well, how am I going to weather this? Because I can't take it apart. I found out it was actually easy enough, because of the way the parts are laid out, that I painted the exterior frame gray, and I made sure if a little bit of black got over, or gray got over on the black part, I was okay with that. But I didn't completely paint the black part in. I just left it bare plastic. When I got this gray part done, I then went back and I brush painted the black part. And because the lines are distinct enough, I was able to keep a very sharp, crisp line. And I just brush painted the whole thing using acrylic paints, black. Then I went in and I dry brushed the black with a light gray. And the reason I did it in that order was if any of the dry brushing got over on these other parts, that was okay, because that's what I planned to do anyway eventually. So it brought out the detail in the solar panels, and I was then able to proceed with dry brushing the rest of the outside here, which wouldn't hurt the inside. And then as I weathered and did everything out here, I was just careful not to get any of that onto the black areas. So if you're building Darth Vader's TIE Fighter, you don't get the benefit of these separate parts, but it's not too difficult to deal with. You just have to kind of take your time and be a little more careful about it. One other thing to note on these solar panels, and I can't remember if it's on the TIE Fighter solar panels, but because these fit inside those gray frames, you see these ejector pin marks? I don't know if they'll show up on camera, but there's ejector pin marks all along here. Now, on this one, they are recessed, meaning they're not a problem. But what you're going to want to do is just run your thumb along there and feel if there's a lip around that, because that little bit of lip may interfere with the fit. If there is a little bit of a lip, if it's giving you some lip, all you got to do to make sure you don't scratch anything else is just take the edge of your hobby blade and just scratch it down like that. This is not going to be seen, so nobody's going to see that there, but it just removes any lip that will interfere with the fit. So be sure and check that out before you assemble these wings. There are also two parts that fit to the upper and lower side of the wing that allow for it to swing up and down. Those will need to be added later on in the assembly after you've painted and weathered the wings, but because of the way the wing pivots around them, the join area is going to be hidden. So those can be fully painted and assembled and the weathering started before the model's ever put together, and then you can bring it together at the end and it will work just fine. Now I'm almost ready to paint, but I want to talk a little bit about the color. Generally, you see TIE fighters in this just slightly bluish light gray, and Bandai gives you the mix here. It's 70% neutral gray, white 30%, and then just a touch of blue gray or blue. And I find that to get this color, I put maybe a little more than just a touch of blue, but what you're going to want to do if you want to go for Canon color is mix out the neutral gray and the white in the ratio they suggest, and then just keep adding drops of blue until you get it to the point that you like it. One thing to be aware of when you're mixing paint, in the bottle, is, let's say you're mixing it in a color cup or something, so you'll have a nice supply of it to use throughout the build. It will look one way in that little container. When you put it on the model, it's going to look much less desaturated generally. So if it looks fairly blue-gray to you and you like the color of it, test a patch of it on the model and see if that's what you want. In most cases, I've had to add a little more blue. And I like mine to not just suggest a little blue, but to be leaning a little more towards the bluish than even they show here, because it shows up better on camera and on film. Now, I have read, I've never met George Lucas or anybody who worked on Star Wars, so I'm not sure, but I have read that in the original film, Star Wars, the one without Jar Jar Binks, but Star Wars, released in 1977, that they painted the TIE fighters gray. They had originally wanted to do the blue-gray, but it was not showing up well against, I guess, the green screens or blue screens or whatever they were filming against. So they went with neutral gray. So you get to decide whether you want to go for that studio replica look, or do you want to go for a more Canon look and do the blue-gray. Heck, you could paint it purple if you wanted to. But that'll be something that you'll need to decide early on. And you can see on the photos here that there are some darker colored parts that I've already identified that you'll need to paint. On the TIE Fighter, the Advanced TIE Fighter, and the TIE Interceptor, like this canopy part here is more of a neutral gray than the blue-gray. And these bow tie parts are, again, more of a neutral gray than the blue-gray. So there is some distinction on a few of those parts, and it just gives visual interest to the surface of the model. So, and I think it would be within the Star Wars tradition to have maybe a few panels that are slightly different if you're going for a more realistic look in terms of if this were an actual object. On screen, the Empire stuff was all just pretty much gray, but adding a little bit of personality into it can make the surface look fairly nice. I'm planning on doing a little bit of shading and highlighting, some hints at color modulation, just because I like the look of it, not because it's necessarily Canon. I just think it gives it a nice look, so I'll be doing that later on in this video. All right, I got the base color down, and I really like the way it turned out. I wanted it to be a little more bluish than the box art. Now, as I'm looking at this on my display on my camera, and then comparing it to what I'm actually holding in my hand, what's showing on camera looks to be a little more blue than what I'm holding. So I don't know how in the final analysis it's going to come out, but to my eye here holding it, it's exactly what I wanted. It's a medium gray with just enough hint of blue that you can see blue. And I'm really liking the way it looks. Now, what I did was I mixed some AK Interactive Real Color paints, lacquer paints. I started with, as the instructions suggest, 70% neutral gray. And then I added in 30% white. I use this white gray just to keep it in the gray range. Now what I did was I used one of these little cups with the marking lines on it to make getting the ratios very easy. After I mix that up, I begin dropping in 1 drop at a time. Now they say, you know, put in a dash of blue, but this blue must not be real strong, because I ended up putting in probably, I was dipping it in with a toothpick and letting the drop fall into the paint. I probably ended up putting in about, I lost count, but it was maybe 12 to 15 drops of blue. And what I would do is I would put the blue in, and then I would mix it with my electric stirring tool, and then I'd put another drop in and I'd mix it. Towards the end, I got tired of putting in single drops and started putting in 3 at a time, and did that a couple of times and finally got the color that I wanted. Now I made enough in here to make sure that I could fill up my color cup that I was painting with, but then I also made enough that I could have this little spare bottle of it. So as I'm working through the project, if I need to touch anything up, if I need to do any additional airbrushing, whatever, I've got some made. I highly recommend that anytime you make a custom color mix, that you either have some spare jars like this to put it in, or you know, some spare dropper bottles like that to put it in, something to keep an extra amount of it. My rule of thumb is I try to keep at least as much paint standing by mixed up as what it took to paint the model, just because it's really infuriating to get a color mix just like you want it, and then get, you know, almost to the end of the project and realize you forgot to paint something, or you need some more and you don't have any of it, or you don't have enough. So I like making sure that I have enough. Now, to make sure that all of the color values matched, and this was partly because I wanted the color values to match, and I'll admit partly out of just laziness, when it came to painting the other parts that are darker colors, all I did was just added in some flat black to the paint that was already in my color cup, this blue-gray paint, and went with darker tones of this just to keep it all cohesive and to make it simpler. So this forward canopy piece is a darker version of this, a much darker version of this, which will go on that, and also the little bow ties that go on either side. I did that in that color. And then for the solar panels, I just added more black to it. So it's really just almost, if you're familiar with Tamiya's XF69 NATO black, it's basically, I created NATO black, but it's not pure black, which means when I dry brush over it and then put washes in there, there'll be some variation in color. I rarely paint things in pure black because that doesn't leave you any room for shadows. It doesn't leave you any room to put in a wash or anything like that. So usually I go with something that's a very dark gray, and then I can add shadows and highlights to it. So all of the parts on here, the colors come from this base color, which I hope will just give it kind of a pleasing cohesiveness, even if somebody's not consciously aware of it when they look at the model. One thing I did want to mention, I forgot to point out that I partially assembled some of these parts. These lower parts I went ahead and glued in. I temporarily pushed this one in place. It's easy enough to pull off of there. That way, once I assemble the wings, I can just stick them on there, stick this down on it, and add a few other parts, and it'll be ready to go. What I want to do now is just some basic color variation, some highlighting, maybe bordering on modulation, but I'm not officially calling it modulation, because I've seen people who can do really good modulation, and I don't want to step into that territory and claim that, oh look, I modulated this. So it's just going to be some highlights, and I'll put those on with my airbrush, and I'll just take this base color that I've got, and I'll put some of that in my color cup and lighten it up with this white gray, and thin it down a little heavier than I would just for normal painting, and add those on here. Now I made a mistake when I mixed up this paint. I started with the base paint and added white to it. So when I initially started airbrushing, it just wasn't showing up like I wanted. What I should have done, and I know better, and this was very frustrating for me, was I should have started with the white paint and then added the base to it. When you're working with colors these light, you want to bring white down to the color you want rather than trying to bring the base down, because you have to add a whole lot of white to the base to get it like you wanted. So I went back, kind of did a reset, and got the paint like I wanted and began spraying again. And once I changed my mix of paint and began spraying, I started getting much more dramatic highlights, which was what I was wanting. Now I'm using a 0.2 nozzle airbrush here, so it's allowing me fine control. I am, as I always complain about, I am working around the camera, which makes it more difficult. When I later went back and fine-tuned this, I had my optivisor on. I had it about 2 inches from my face, and I could actually really see what I was doing. But all I'm trying to do here is just make various panels lighter, introduce some fading. What began as an attempt at maybe kind of a lowbrow color modulation, I started liking the look of it, and just on the fly just began adjusting the way I was doing it so that it became more of a paint distressing and modulation process. And the beauty of this is you just thin your paint down and you go in real lightly, as you can see that I'm doing here, and you just make multiple passes until you build up the color that you want. And it doesn't have to be the same color across the entire model. You can have some areas that are more faded than others, some that are not faded, and it just gives you, I think, a really visually interesting look, which is the goal for this process. It's not the end-all be-all of weathering, but it's just a basis for it. So I continued on working on the other parts, trying to get these little raised edges on the wing areas. And I wasn't worried about being too precise, because I know with later washes and other weathering, it's going to tighten that up a bit. As I hear my friend Lincoln Wright say all the time, start loose, end tight. So that's the process I'm doing here, is just adding in some of these highlights and getting the parts to where they have just a little more visual interest to the model. All right, the intended modulation went to modulation and distressing. I added some highlights and some distressing. The more I started applying the modulation, the more I liked, in a few areas where I got some overspray, the more I liked the idea of distressing. Now, distressing, if you're not familiar with that term, and I don't know that it's the perfect term for it, but it's just a process of making paint look like it's faded, that it's sat outside, that it's been in use. It's not, it breaks up the monotone look of it. Now, it's not an end-all be-all in terms of weathering. It's not a final weathering step. It's the basis for later weathering to come. And you can do it a lot more than this. You can do it a lot less. Sometimes it takes on kind of a post-shading or post-fading look, rather. In this case, I did try to avoid the panel lines generally. I don't always do that. But once later washes are added and streaks and things like that, this will serve as a good undercoat, as a good base for that. Now, normally I wouldn't do a TIE Fighter this weathered, but if you'll remember in the movie Rogue One, it operated in a tropical environment. So I'm basing the weathering that I'm doing on this kit kind of on what I saw, when I built World War II aircraft, what I saw of those that served in the South Pacific. They tended to be a lot more faded, a lot more streaked. And I just want to kind of recreate some of that on here, maybe not to the degree that you saw those in World War II, but to definitely suggest that this thing is operating in an atmosphere, in a tropical environment where there's probably rain and dirt and mud, and when it gets on the ground, all of those things, when it's landed, it may have to deal with those. And we saw that it flew around really low and swooped over the water and over the beaches and everything else. So that's going to have its effect. So I want it to reflect that reality from the movie, even if it's not necessarily canon. All right, well, I think I'm going to call this video done. I've accomplished what I wanted to do in this part of the video, which was go into some detail on the assembly and getting this guy together, and then talk about the colors. Remember, I talked about there's the gray from the first movie, and then there's the blue gray that we saw in later movies. So that's always something to think about. And then I got it painted and did a little bit of the initial distressing and modulation that I want to do, and everything's set up now to begin weathering, which will be in the next video. Now, I'm not sure if the next video will cover all of the weathering or if I'll break it up into two. It just depends on how far I want to go with it. I do plan to take this, as I've hinted at, a little further than you would normally see on a TIE Fighter. One, because of canon reasons, where it was operating, but two, I just want to kind of show you know, a variety of techniques, a variety of things that you can do so that you can take it from a little bit weathered to fairly heavily weathered, and just see some things that will work in getting that done. So thank you so much for watching this video, especially if you're still watching at this point. I'm very grateful that you've hung out and hung along in here with me for this amount of time. If you have not done so, I would really appreciate it if you would click down there somewhere and subscribe to this channel, and click the little bell icon so you'll know that when I have new videos out. And there's also some links down below to social media. So if you would like to connect with me there, I would be most grateful. I love hearing from people. Please don't ever hesitate to contact me. I'm happy to answer questions, to hear things that you do, to learn what you do so that I can grow myself as a modeler. And sometimes, you know, if you just want to talk modeling, I enjoy that. So please don't ever hesitate to contact me. I'll always respond, and I always like hearing from people. There's also links down below, a link down below to my Patreon account. I do have Patreon, and I'd be grateful if you'd take a look at that and see the levels that I offer there and the rewards that come with it. And if you would consider supporting me on Patreon, I would be most grateful. And if you're already a Patreon supporter, thank you very much. It's your support that makes what I do possible. I wouldn't have been able to get this kit. I wouldn't be able to have the airbrushes I have, and the paints that I have, and the website and the hosting and all of the things that go into being able to do this in a more public way. It's the patrons who support me on Patreon that make that possible. So thank you very much. I'm most grateful for your support, me and my family, because it's a blessing to all of us. So thank you very much. And as always, I'll leave you with a final thought. In this hobby, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.